So I don't know if other people have experience, taking classes online like this, but this is my first time and it's very weird.
Yeah, me too.
Especially since I've been watching your videos, Justin, and yours too, Johannes, and it's weird to have your virtual persona sort of
yeah
right in front of me and
first time for me too.
Accessible.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, this is our first time doing this type of online course also. So it's a little weird for us in a good way for us anyway. It seems, I mean, I'm pretty into it, but it's okay. Hopefully by the time we're done after 2 hours, everyone will feel at home and, settled in.
It's the uncanny.
Yeah.
The frantic, what is it? The frantic destruction of distance brings no nearness.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right, but you did mention, Johannes, that there's something, I mean, you seem sort of thrilled by the, just the sheer acceleration, like the practical functional acceleration that this sort of technology makes possible. And yeah, I don't know, what do you think? I mean, is this, what do you think Heidegger would think of it that way?
We'll find out.
It can be the opening question. That's a good question.
Good question. Yes.
Just hang on to that, Nick.
We'll just wait a couple more minutes. I think.
Yeah, honestly, I think we gave people 3 minutes. I think we can just go ahead and start. There we go. We got David in the house. We'll add him.
Okay.
What's up, David? How's it going? And I think we give people 3 minutes. So if people want to come in late, that's perfectly fine. We won't shame them for their tardiness, but we also won't repeat ourselves or circle back. I think we can go ahead and start. What do you think, Johannes?
Got to turn on the microphones, everyone. That's all I want to
people, your microphone when you come in the room is off by default, and then you just have to turn it on. And actually, as a general rule, probably makes sense to keep yourself muted when you're not talking, and then only when you want to talk, unmute yourself, just to make sure everything's nice and quiet and stable. Sound good, everyone? Should we go ahead and get started? Johannes? Yeah? All right, let's do it. So first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. As Nick was saying just a minute ago, it is a little bit weird, having this kind of philosophical seminar experience hosted totally virtually. And it's our first time doing anything quite like this. So if it's a little weird for you, that's okay. It's a little weird for us, but we're very excited. We think this is a really exciting opportunity, and we're just really grateful to have you here. We're really grateful for your interest. Precisely because this is a very new type of thing. This is a very new world that we're all exploring. The digital possibilities for interesting intellectual exploration. We're happy that you took a chance on us, because this is still not fully tested and no one really knows what exactly this is going to be like, us included. So yeah, just thank you for being here, first of all. And we're really looking forward to talking with you for the next 2 hours and then more times over the next few weeks. So we're going to structure this session, the seminar, with a very simple format, very straightforward. We think that what would be best is we start off with everyone giving just very short introductions. Just basically say hello, say your name, and just say 1 or 2 lines about what brings you here, what you're interested in, what you're working on. Just summarize yourself and your interests in this course and what you're hoping to do with it or why you're here in whatever way makes the most sense to you. Just, 1 or 2 sentences is perfectly fine. And if you want to, maybe tell us maybe where you're calling in from, just out of curiosity. It'd be interesting to know where people are. And I think that's about it. So if everyone just wants to give a really short introductory spiel about themselves, to introduce themselves to each other. We are going to be talking, multiple times over the next few weeks. So it'd be good for us to kind of get to know each other. And then when everyone is done giving some very short intros, we will just open it up to discussion, really. And we'll be structuring that and facilitating that. And Johannes and I will do what we can to make that maximally productive and useful for everyone. But the onus will really be on you folks to talk about what you want to talk about and ask the questions that you want to ask, or express the ideas or commentaries that you want to develop. Okay. So we're pretty much here for you, and we'll, give you feedback, give you our answers, give you our responses, and, whatever. If you want us to talk about certain things, we're happy to. It's very flexible, but mostly we want you to know this is for you, really. And we're here to help support your ideas, answer your questions, and connect you all with each other, and what will hopefully be a valuable and enriching kind of collective experience. So that's that's really all there is to it. We'll probably start after the intros. We'll start off with you folks can ask any questions that you want. Maybe if you have particular issues or ideas or comments or questions that you came to while you were going through the material or reading Deleuze or Heidegger, we can start off with those. You can ask any question, whatever you want. And if we run out of those, then we can turn to some questions that Johannes and I are happy to provide to keep things, running smoothly. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on with it then. And I'd like to ask you all to introduce yourselves. I don't know what order we want to go. And I guess I'll just go in the order of the names as I see them. So I'll just call on you if you don't mind that. So the first name in my list is Nick. Nick, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nick. I'm glad to see this is a small course. I mean, it would be nice to have more people involved, obviously, but I like small classes, and I'm pleased to see that it's going to be a tight group here. So yeah, what can I say? So I'm a recent college graduate. I graduated college last year as a German major. And shamefully enough, I'm one of these sort of theory kids who read a lot more Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida, the French postmodernists, than I'm hardly at all familiar with Heidegger. And so when I came across the live stream that Johannes and Justin did, that sort of inspired me to start reading Heidegger. And I can read him in German, which is nice. So my major was worth something after all. So basically interested in theory. I think Heidegger and Deleuze are probably, in the long term, they'll probably be viewed as the two greatest philosophers of the 20th century. It would be Heidegger, the greatest philosopher of the first half of the 20th century, and Deleuze, I think he will stand the test of time among the Frenchies, being, sorry.
Cool.
Got a call there. But yeah, anyway, so I'm just interested in this stuff, recent college graduate, not really, a professional of any kind, but yeah, and I'm calling in from Austria. Actually, I'm teaching English here. So yeah.
Awesome. Great to have you, Nick. Thanks for introducing yourself. And that's lovely. Perfect. Next up on my list, as I see it, is Mario. Mario, introduce yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mario. I'm in The Hague in the Netherlands. I'm working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Erasmus Medical University and in medical education. And in my free time, I'm doing philosophy. I'm working on a book. That's also why I'm interested in the course. I've read a lot of Heidegger and Deleuze and Adorno and many other philosophers, but I prefer to stay away from secondary literature and discuss it with other people. So for me, this is an opportunity to kind of test my own ideas and to see what other people read into it.
Perfect.
And this is my cat, James. Some others might join later.
Okay.
Sure. Excellent. Thanks, Mario. Next up, I see Raven.
Hi, everybody. I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon. I got into this course because I'm interested in the philosophy of technology. I'm in a philosophy group here in the flesh in Portland that meets up regularly. I'm running a course on game theory right now. And I'm pretty much interested at the intersection of taking abstraction and concepts and bringing it into physical reality. So I'm a carpenter and work in design. And so what I'm trying to work on is bringing these ideas into meat space, essentially, through throwing events, big parties, essentially. So
wow.
Yeah, I'm here for the rich kind of aesthetic qualities of this work. And so I'm really interested in the perspectives that these two philosophers have on art and poetics, and the metaphors and the analogies that are used and how those can be represented in physical reality.
Amazing. Very cool. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Next up, I see Joshua.
Hey, what's going on? Is this crazy thing working?
Yeah, you're good.
Oh, beautiful. So I'm Joshua. I'm calling in from I'm in the New York City area over here. And my areas of interest are basically the counter-enlightenment, philosophy of tech, and desire. And some of the guys I'm rolling with are basically like Rousseau, Kant, Hamann. And, that's basically, I'm very interested in the critique of the academy at the moment. And that's basically, I'll keep it short. I'm amped for this whole thing.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Joshua. We're amped to have you here. Next up, I see Mark.
Good afternoon, everybody. I came here because I sort of had a bit of a road to Damascus moment the first time I read The Question Concerning Technology, and I've never really stopped studying it. I've just finished a master's thesis on Heidegger and artificial intelligence and other Heideggerians like Dreyfus. To the point where I went from studying philosophy to working at a futurist tech policy think tank. And so despite the flag, I'm actually calling in from Washington, D.C. On the Deleuze side, this is my first experience with him at all. And I was very interested to read the postscripts on the societies of control, because this is essentially what my think tank, what some places like Aspen, some of the startups we work with are trying to do. We're building this society of control. And that makes me rather interested in how either we could build escape routes into it, or in some way find a way out from that control.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. It's awesome. Next up, I see Kevin MC. What's up, Kevin MC?
Hey, everybody. I'm Kevin McCoy. I'm calling in from Brooklyn, New York. I'm an artist. I work collaboratively with my wife, Jennifer McCoy. I'm also a professor in the art department at NYU. I have a philosophy undergraduate degree from way back in the day, where I studied I studied a lot of Heidegger, Nietzsche, French philosophy. Did some graduate work in that in France long ago. I'm supporting Justin. Really curious to see what he's doing, and wanted to see this course and kind of just see what the whole format was, what the whole form was, how it all kind of worked. I feel like I'm coming back. These ideas I feel like I was engaging with a lot, like in the 90s, early 2000s, and then did other things. But now I really feel a need to come back to those things for work that I'm doing. Yeah, that's it. Just really excited to be part of the discussion.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, Kevin. Really glad to have you here. Next up, Alex. What's up, Alex Talon?
Hi. I'm calling in from Los Angeles, excited to be here. And yeah, I'm from like a music and art background, but I studied history in college, and I went to UC Santa Cruz, and it was a very steeped in postmodernism. So that was, presented to us early on. But as a history person, I was kind of really interested in mapping ideologies in certain ways. And so German conservative revolution, the relation of that to Heidegger is interesting to me. And I've been interested in, aspects of Dugin, and I see the way that like Dugin interacts with Deleuze and Heidegger. And I feel like, my main partner in this kind of like music cultural project I'm doing is a huge Deleuzian. So I need to, I feel like I need to get some more understanding of that. I'm stoked to be here.
Cool.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Great to have you here, Alex. David B. What's going on?
Hey, I am in Birmingham, Alabama, and dropped out of academia. My background is psychology in cognitive neuroscience, and I now work as a psychologist in a marketing agency. And I'm also a folk singer, so music is a big aspect of my life. And I'm just generally interested in how technology is going to shape people's psychology and change us as a society as it continues to roll along with social media and the internet and everything. So I'm actually not familiar with Heidegger or Deleuze, but what I've been exposed to so far through these materials is super interesting. So I'm excited that people are talking about these things, and looking forward to learning more.
Great.
Sounds good. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. Next up, Lim. How's it going, Lim?
Hey everybody, my name is Lewis. I put Lim there just because it's my initials. I have an undergrad degree in philosophy and classical languages. Basically, I'm just a super obsessed Heidegger aficionado, and basically getting into Heidegger, I was like, okay, I want to learn whatever Heidegger learned. And so that made me learn classical languages, made me learn all about like German idealism and tons of things like that. So I'm here mainly, I guess, for the Heidegger, but after reading the Deleuze, this is my first exposure to Deleuze in like a real sustained way. I was pretty impressed actually with the postscript. Despite it only being 7 pages, I thought it was a pretty powerful text. So yeah, I'm just here to talk about all those ideas.
Excellent. Great to have you. Brian Knuckles, what's going on?
Hey y'all. I'm Brian. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm a drug and alcohol counselor and a Jungian analyst. Justin, I first came across some of Justin's work, and he's really helped me validate some of my ideas using personality, the Big Five personality test. So that's been cool. And I've really, the Deleuze is coming into my work because I'm really interested in tactical things for people to work with addiction. But it's also been interesting to come across Johannes's work in Heidegger. I'm interested in phenomenology, and especially on the Jungian side, using creativity and imagination as a way to reveal healing and truth. So this idea of aletheia has been really fun to grapple with and try to understand. So I appreciate it on the seminar on from multiple registers. So I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. And finally, I think our third Brian, if I'm counting correctly. No, just our second. Okay. Brian, what's going on? Brian too.
Yeah, hey, how's it going, folks? I'll turn on the video camera for a little bit, but I'm going to straighten up and make some coffee while I listen, so I might turn that back off again. I apologize. So this is my first real introduction to Deleuze and Heidegger, so I'm really excited for that. I'm interested in what I've seen so far. I studied philosophy in college, did a lot in the analytics side, so I'm not super familiar with the whole continental space, mostly like Wittgenstein, Quine, philosophy of science. I'm really interested in the union between like math and philosophy, how we can take formal models and apply them to philosophical concepts and like work that machinery to produce results, which I think is very close to what we're talking about here. So it's very interesting. Specifically, I'm interested in like thermodynamic agency and like far from equilibrium systems. And like I think a lot of what we were talking about in the Heidegger lectures is spot on for that stuff. So I'm really excited to see where we go with this.
Great.
Excellent.
Great.
Awesome. Brian, I think we heard all of that, but you did seem a little bit softer than some of the others. Maybe turn your mic up a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do.
You're fine. You're fine. Awesome. Excellent. This is so cool. I'm suddenly like 3 times more pumped than I was even coming into this. And I was pretty pumped coming into this just because this seems like a really cool, smart, eclectic group. So this is just so awesome. Very happy. So, all right, let's do this then. Everyone got to introduce each other, got to introduce themselves. So we know a little bit about, who we're working with, which is helpful. That will help us kind of steer conversation possibly. Johannes, do you, I've been talking up until now. Do you want to chime in with anything, or are you happy for me to just kind of carry on with
continue?
Okay. Thanks, Johannes. So yeah, the template, as I said, is very simple. We'd like to now turn it over to you folks to initiate the seminar with any questions that you have, and we'll work from there. Nick, I think originally floated one. I'm happy to start with that one if we want to. And the rest of you can get your thoughts together if you haven't done so already. Nick, would you like to repeat the question that you launched before we actually started?
Sure. I just remarked on something Johannes said about a sense of like almost thrill or maybe vertigo or something. The experience of doing work like this, which is usually in very slow, like viscous, very territorialized institutions like in the academy, but this is totally deterritorialized, right? All of our faces are in these separate little molecular spaces, and we're all together, and it's I think Justin even referred to this sort of thing as like an assemblage or a war machine, some Deleuzian terminology like that. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Heidegger, he saw, he lived, I think, into the 50s or 60s, so he saw the progression of, you know, telecommunications technology and the possibilities and the dangers of it. But, you know, I wonder what he would think of something like this. You know, this seems, you know, the internet in general seems like on a whole another level, and something that Heidegger maybe didn't really foresee. So I was going to ask Johannes, you know, what do you think Heidegger would make of the internet as a phenomenon?
That's a good question. It's always difficult to say, right? Because that's often the question that I get is, what would Heidegger say? And I don't know. I didn't meet him. But what I can say, because there's different questions in here. One of them is, what's the nature of teaching? Well, how should we teach? This is deterritorial. I can never pronounce that word, but you know what I mean. In a sense that the university can be. But there's a talk by Heidegger that Heidegger gives actually as his welcoming lecture in 1929 in Freiburg in Germany, where he says that the university is at this point no longer a university. The university is simply, he calls it planetary, calls the university, basically, we could translate this into what we could now think of as just a place where the managerial caste is being educated to manage the cyber, you know, he wouldn't call it cybernetic at the time, but in the 50s and 60s he does. I think that, you know, I'm not sure where the question is coming from. Is it because you think that Heidegger would be too conservative to accept of this, or is it because you think that Heidegger is too critical of technology? I think that what he might be approving actually of the fact that that people who want to think and question and read deinstitutionalize themselves and go somewhere else and go outside the university. So something that he tried to do throughout his life is actually bring people together in a room just to work through certain questions. He wasn't very fond of the university and where it was going from very early on. And it was still quite good when he was a professor. And also he gave public talks. One of the things that, you know, so for example, the one talk you probably that everyone's aware of is the question concerning technology that was not given to philosophers at a philosophy conference. That was given to engineers or students of engineering at the Technical University of Munich. He gave talks to teachers. He gave talks to the Hölderlin Society. Heidegger was a very public philosopher. He also gave more television interviews than people would probably think. So he would not, I think, be entirely opposed to this, but he would also say, and this is a direct quote from him, that we don't, while we are engaging in this, we have to be mindful of the fact that we don't really know that we can use these tools or these machines that we're using right now, but we don't know how they function. So one of the things he says in the late 1960s in an interview that you can actually find on YouTube, which is that, you know, we can all use a radio, but none of us know how a radio works. Well, maybe 4 or 5 physicists in the world can fully explain how the radio functions. And we're at the point where we can use all these different tools, but we don't really know how they function. So what Heidegger, I think, would want is to take a questioning stance, if that makes sense, right? To not simply just immediately follow and just take everything at its sort of its functional value, but also question where something comes from, what it does to us while we use it, if that makes sense. And I think ultimately Heidegger would be, I think that someone like Nietzsche, or even in Heidegger to some degree, wouldn't be opposed to using the internet for this, right? It's not about that the internet per se is bad or weird or something that we shouldn't use. Because he says weird things about technology. He says it brings us closer to being. Justin mentions that in his lecture too. Maybe you can say a bit about that. So I'm just opening this up a bit to say that I think ultimately this gives us, look, I think what this does is, and what I emailed Justin was, it's accelerating in the sense that I've written a PhD thesis on Heidegger, just from my personal experience. When you write a PhD thesis on Heidegger, you're actually controlled, right? Not by anyone else, but you're just controlled by the fact that you have to write it in a certain way, so that you can pass your viva. And then I rewrote the thesis last year to get it published by a major, some ridiculous big academic publishing house. And then again, you have to quote the right people. But this time was one of the first times in years where I just sat down, and while I was writing, there was no one, because I know that Justin doesn't care who I quote, right? And no one else would kind of, oh, but you can't quote him because he's out of fashion, etc. And that would be very much what Heidegger wanted, very much, I would say, because it would be that kind of freedom that you have to take, and that actually that comes back to the topic of escape, right? How do we escape or exit from, by not playing the game? By not playing the game. And Heidegger is all about not playing the game, but being released and relieved and taking a step back and then following your own path. He's all about finding your own new path, right? So just as an introduction, sorry, yeah.
No, that's great. I'm just curious, would anyone else like to comment on this question, or perhaps consider commenting or answering a slightly different question if you want to kind of interpret Nick's initial question in a slightly different light that perhaps is more aligned with something that you're thinking about or you're interested in. And by the way, folks, in terms of protocol, I think this group is small enough that we can have a pretty much anarchistic, laissez-faire kind of system where, like, if you want to speak up or if you want to interject politely for something really relevant, everyone should feel free to pretty much speak at will. Obviously be polite and respectful, but I think if it gets out of hand, maybe I'll institute some different system. But for now, everyone should feel free to pretty much have free exchange.
I wanted to comment just kind of on the format of these kind of groups. One thing, Justin, you had shared, I think in some kind of writing you had done, this really provocative idea about kind of having the courage, like, not to make sense yet. So like maybe a critique of some traditional or maybe more even modern pedagogy is like, you have to have these like learning objectives and like this really like set out, like, this is what we're going to accomplish in the seminar. And so I think it is kind of like interesting to kind of have this interesting format where we don't really quite know if Heidegger is going to like it or not yet. Like, maybe he would have hated it, maybe he would have really liked it. We don't really, it could kind of go in different directions where it could become, who knows what, and almost having that opening is, I think, really, really intriguing. And it's kind of like scary as well. Cause like, what if this, I mean, not really scary, but it's kind of pushes against some conditioned notions of what you're supposed to accomplish in a 2-hour seminar.
Right.
I should take something. It's another great idea Justin has shared with me that's been really important, is like instrumental rationality, and saying like, we're not necessarily looking for a credential. There's more upside if you step back from that, and there's also the downside risk of maybe just go on a bunch of tangents, but the upside is ultimately something crystallized is that you could have never expected.
Well, I think people should be free to, in this session, people should be free to deterritorialize as they wish. It's our job. It's our job as the seminar hosts to keep things on track and to make and to try to provide a kind of ongoing coherence. But you all can play jazz, express any idea you want, any question you want, do some kind of crazy dance performance if you want to. We don't care.
With the question about like with Heidegger and the internet, I wonder like what is his level of concern, because he seems to be into this kind of like the opening and the unconcealment. When does and I get that in like a really macro way he's about like creating a new beginning, but like what are the pitfalls of like, are there types of openings or beginnings that are deceptive, or are there that's I guess that's
super question. That's always so Heidegger is all, someone mentioned before Alethea, I think it was Brian Knuckles, right? So we talk aletheia is Heidegger's so if you just want to just on Heidegger briefly, Heidegger is ignited as a thinker, so he becomes Heidegger, right? The free thinker that he was when he begins to translate very early on the word aletheia the way he does, which is not as truth, which we usually think of as verification or correspondence, right? My representation of the world corresponds to the object or the other. No, but unconcealment, but concealment and unconcealment at the same time. So you cannot have an opening without closure. And he takes that to an absolute sort of fringe way of thinking towards the end of his philosophical career, where he in German he calls this die Lichtung des sich Verbergens, and that means the clearing for self-concealment. So actually at the heart of any opening, at the heart of any self-disclosure, there is concealment. So there's always the trouble, the issue of that there could be something very deceptive, that there could be something that's illusionary, there could be occultatio or dissimulatio, dissimulation or occultation, right? But the trick is to never forget that there could be in any opening, that there's always concealment at play too. And then that, what he means then on a philosophical level with the new beginning, is that history just, you could, I think, translate it like that. History hasn't ended. We're not living through some magical end time. And actually what we have to do in order to find a new beginning is not to cut off ourselves from origin, but to read it again, come back to it, but read it in a different way that's not as, if you like, encrusted as the tradition has made it out to be. So you read it in a poetic way, and then all of a sudden that bursts open the possibility to no longer read the cave as this boring story of this is how the philosopher is educated. But no, you read the cave as suddenly, when you read Plato's cave, that's the world we live in, right? So we live in a world where shadows make up our reality, and we have to distinguish, and that's the oldest story of philosophy, is do we see the shadows as shadows? So there's something concealed about the shadows. And that's what he's trying, I think, to get to make us understand again, that there's this incredible truth in philosophical texts. And by the way, just as a side note, because I always mention this in seminars and wherever else, there's a wonderful short story by a British author called E.M. Foster. The story is called The Machine Stops, from 1910. And he describes something that we're doing right now, which is people sit in their cubicles, sit in front of screens and talk to each other about ideas. So just that's kind of the manifestation of the cave in a mechanical way. But very good question. There's always also the issue of it could be deception.
Does anyone else want to riff on Heidegger and the internet or something related?
Yeah, I wanted to mention just kind of more of a comment, by the way, is I think it's in the Heraclitus seminar in a few places. Heidegger died in 1976, so he actually lived pretty well into the 20th century.
Yeah.
I think it's in the Heraclitus seminar and maybe a few other places. Heidegger actually used the word cybernetics. He actually says like cybernetics is this new science that's coming about, and he says like things that seem like they seem like spookily prescient. Like he says like cybernetics will become the dominant science that will dominate all the other sciences. And as we see like information technology becoming, infiltrating more and more all aspects of our disciplines. We almost like don't even have to speculate about what he would have thought. Insofar as we want to say that cybernetics is the internet, that might not be a fair identification. I think they're probably a little bit different. Cybernetics comes earlier than the internet, but we don't have to speculate wildly. Like he did have comments that were directly about it, and basically he says that he predicts cybernetics being like the most powerful science like here to date. So
yes.
So what I can say about that is that what fascinates me about the essay about technology is that, as Johannes also said, that we have to be humble. So we can start with, we have no idea what the internet is. And when we have no idea about something, usually we associate that with like black matter or black holes or something that we don't know much about.
Mm-hmm.
But actually here it's the other way around. We know everything. We know so many correct things about it, where you don't see the forest for the trees because we know so much about it. So because it's in your face, like right now we're all looking at the screen. Yeah. And we're aware of that it is a screen. That's already, I guess, the first step. Only we still experience it as something strange. So one thought experiment that we could do is, I'm thinking of, there's an essay by Slavoj Žižek called something about the desert of the real, where he talks about 9/11. Mm. And what he says there is that 9/11 is nothing new. Actually, we've been imagining it over and over again. All our movies were about that, were about like monsters crashing into buildings. And now it's become a reality. So we could look at the internet like that before it was even technologically possible. That we were already imagining this. So this is just one manifestation of it.
Okay.
And there could also be a next step. So that the next step is interesting for me as well.
So I feel like I want to riff a little bit about the origin of the internet, because as you say that, you know, the origin of the internet is kind of not what you would expect. I mean, it's originally a government, you know, national security initiative, right? And it's in this milieu of the Cold War, where, you know, I mean, I think that World War II, the end of World War II, closed a chapter of sort of traditional, you know, history of warfare, and then we moved into this sort of weird Cold War story where basically war is always already simulated, and so war is fought on the front of, you know, intelligence and even game theory, for whoever mentioned that they were interested in game theory. I mean, war becomes the simulation of war and finding the equilibrium and the mutually assured destruction that balances out these forces. And the internet, how that plays into it is, you know, this idea of a network which is robust against even total nuclear annihilation. So you can have like pretty much all, you know, the majority of the nodes destroyed by a nuclear attack, but the internet as a whole is still functions and it's still secure. And so it's almost this ideal of technology that never fails. And for Heidegger, you know, the moment that technology fails, the broken hammer is, you know, the moment of you know, revealing and concealment, right? It's an important moment for him. But the internet is almost this attempt to avoid that moment entirely by creating this distributed machinery that no matter how you attack it, it's distributed, so it's robust against attack. I wonder if anyone else has any comment on that.
Very briefly, all very good points. Very briefly, just on Nick, very briefly. So there's something lost in translation when the general translation is the question concerning technology. Because I think in the English vernacular, technology could be, you know, there's no difference between a hammer and nuclear power plant or the internet. They're also, you know, to some degree tools if you think of them as technology. But Heidegger wants to think of them as, I translate it as techniques. So technique is something else. It is not the tool, right? It's not the radio. It's not the nuclear bomb. Very briefly, it's a way of being, disclosing itself so that everything becomes a standing reserve, which then lights up in this manner of a cybernetic positive feedback loop. And that's a seemingly all-exclusive system, but that still isn't absolute. So it doesn't even need to break down for there to be another dimension thanks to which we can exist. But that's very briefly. So carry the discussion on. I think it's going in a very good direction.
Great. So does anyone who hasn't spoken yet, is anyone really interested in this topic and want to add something to this topic if you haven't spoken yet? If not, that's fine too. Then we'll just move on to topics that you're interested in. Go ahead.
I just had a question about concealment. From the reading, it seemed that there is sort of two levels of unconcealment, but there's a sense that people want to unconceal from the first level, but remain unconcealed at a second level. But that's not what I'm really. I feel like that's not really what it is. And I'm just trying to figure out what does it mean by that.
Yeah, there's at least two levels of concealment, unconcealment. So that's coming back to what Mario said before. We're looking at screens, right? That's what you said, Mario. We're looking at screens, and there's something that's present. The trouble is that human beings were always already in. We need presence, right? The moment is present. Whatever is in front of us is present. That, to a certain degree, is always disclosed, unconcealed. There's openness. That very openness, however, can, just to speak in the metaphor, we keep staring at the sun. Light needs shadow. Darkness needs the other way around. Light needs darkness, etc. In order for there to be this, if you have sheer light, as the Enlightenment rationality assumed, then you end up in a very encrusted system too. Yes, there are always, the trouble is, I think for Heidegger, is that what we think we see, that we tend to believe that that's it, that we actually see the essence of something in something that we've reified. So, for example, in the Letter on Humanism, which is a text that Heidegger writes as a letter to a friend in France, he writes it in, I think, in the late 1940s, he says it might be that nature does not show herself to us in the results we find about her. That's a way of describing what you just said, that there can be something that's unconcealed, disclosed about something, but that doesn't mean that we've seen the entire essence of something, right? So it seems like it's fully revealed, but it might not be, because there's what's hidden, what's concealed is concealment itself, is that nothing ever is fully there for us to operate with. You can't turn nature into a tool, right? We can't calculate anything and everything in a perfect way so that we can operate with it without there being any kind of sort of mistake that we could make. We assume, though, coming back to what Nick said on, what you described as this perfect system of noughts, which is like a Kantian critical system, right? Which is a priori. So the Kant's metaphysics, and it is a metaphysics, I think, it is the critical system establishes an a priori system where nature itself doesn't matter. Nature itself is a fiction. What matters is our representations or our categorization of the objectivity. So what's always concealed is things in themselves to which we have no access. And what we think that we find in nature always forgets, according to Heidegger, that there's something that stays unrevealed and concealed. And this is why he quotes, or he comes back. I don't know if you've read Giovanni. Is that how I say your name?
Yes, that's correct.
Cool. So I don't know if you've read The Question Concerning Technology, but Heidegger there talks about physis or physis, nature in the Greek sense. And he likes to quote Heraclitus, who in a fragment says, physis cryptistai phile. So nature likes to hide herself. And he comes back to that thought that the Greeks had, which is that nature is, nature, and I'm going to use the female, she's free, right? There's something, she's doing her own thing, if you like, and doing this in her own right and in her own ways, and we don't have full access to that. But what we think is that we do have full access to everything, and that's actually a concealment. That's a concealment in itself. And yeah, so this is why in the Heraclitus lectures, I think, to come back to what Lewis said, Heidegger mentions cybernetics, etc., and he talks about this, and he actually also says that philosophy is dead now because philosophy is turned into a way of the natural sciences explaining the world and actually making the world move. But yeah, that was a good question. I think concealment will come back. You'll see, I know how much you've read so far of the lectures of Heidegger, but you'll see that it's all about understanding concealment and unconcealment. So the most fundamental thought you have to get into your minds now is there's no disclosure without concealment, and no concealment without disclosure. No light without darkness.
Nice. Great. So I really just want to make sure that everyone gets plenty of time to talk about what they are most interested in. So if you haven't spoken yet and you're interested in this topic, please chime in now with any extension or commentary or clarifying question you want to propose. If not, that's okay. And then we'll move on. So would anyone else like to talk on this? If you haven't spoken,
I've got an extension, or with not so much about the concealment and the aletheia, but with the Kant kind of counterexample, or using Kant as a as sort of this opposite of Heidegger. And I think with Kant, there's a kind of I don't know the best way to describe it, a kind of loophole in that Kantian system with the nature of the sublime. And so the sublime in the Critique of Judgment is this sort of weird moment where reason isn't able to, reason kind of flips back on itself, kind of recoils from in the face of nature, in the face of the unexplainable. And I think that there's a connection, this is a question for Johannes, of a kind of moment in early Heidegger of a kind of being towards death and being in time, where he talks about that turning back, that the attempt to contemplate death is. That there's this kind of similarity of their thought at that point. So I guess my question is, I don't know if this is something that you've thought about, that this connection between the Kantian sublime versus this kind of death component that you brought up several times in your lectures, with Heidegger, if that's a topic that you could comment on.
I haven't thought about that, so I will have to think about that, and I will say more on that next time, because it wouldn't be righteous, shall we say, to say too much and pretend that I've thought of it, because I haven't. But it's true, I would agree, that in the third critique, Kant has to acknowledge that there's something reason can't fathom. And that's what he calls the sublime. But all in all, what this question points to very importantly is that why is Heidegger Heidegger? Because Heidegger, and this has everything to do with death. In a lecture course from 1925 on the prolegomena on the history of the concept of time, Heidegger says this in Marburg. Heidegger says, Descartes' dictum, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, doesn't make any sense actually. What, if any such formula should make sense, it should be sum moribundus. I am because I am towards my mortality, towards my death. That's how because that's the only certainty the subject or Dasein can have. So there is this attempt to overcome or get out of the subject-object dichotomy, which is, and that's I think what Kant is getting at in the third critique, is that there is something that actually does take the transcendental ego out into the world, and that's the sublime itself. And all of a sudden it's back in nature and with the world, rather than being divided from it in a dichotomy from it as an object. And I think, yes, there is this connection, because it has to do with facing up to an absolute finitude, an absolute horizon against which there is no way, you can't push against it. You can't get rid of it. You can try and push against it, yes, but it'll ultimately win you over. And in that sense, it's awe-inspiring, right? And erhaben, and also takes you up and above. And I think that ultimately this is why what people call transhumanism must work against death, is because that's the last frontier. That's the last, to bring this back to Giovanni's point, death is utter concealment, utter non-availability. I think what Kant is trying to describe in the third critique is that there's something that's not available to subjectivity, and that's also connected to the sublime. It's awe-inspiring in that sense because it's not available for full intellectual comprehension.
And just one last thing to kind of tie the two to death with aletheia, that's the river Leth, right? And that's the river going through the underworld, and that's
Yeah.
about dying and coming back, coming back from dying, passing back through the cavern of, through the, in the myth, it's like the cavern of hypnos, right? Where they're like getting unhypnotized and reawakening and coming back to life from death and through aletheia.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice.
That's all.
Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet want to throw something onto the table? Anything?
I have a question.
Please.
So I'm thinking a lot about how Heidegger's ideas map onto ideas about space and dimension. And thinking about like there's a I feel like a lot of the terminology that's being talked about in terms of how the words are working is about how we make turns in our mind to understand our relationship to things. And Heidegger seems to be like pointing out, okay, this is how the modern world appears to be, or appears to create space in abstraction in terms of how we navigate things. And he seems to be saying that it's a misrepresentation of how world actually is. And I think you get at this with the idea of like planet versus like the idea of Earth. And so I'm just kind of interested if you could like riff on that, just like dimensionality or like kind of a abstract representation of space and how that connects to the specific use of language.
Yeah, very good. So that's not much. I mean, for Heidegger, what you've mentioned is what you could call, I guess, Newtonian physics, where space and time is not just Newtonian physics, the trajectory of all of modernity, that space and time turned into abstractions more and more, and parameters. And not just that, to come back to points made earlier by others on Kant, is that the reason we can fly an airplane and perfectly plan when the airplane takes off and where it lands, etc., is thanks to transcendental logic, which I like to refer to in German as Setzungslogik. That means a logic of positing, by which the subject or subjectivity posits the a priori, the results of what's demanded, and space and time for that must have no essence or no dimension of their own. They must stand ready themselves as parameters that can be operated and that can be used in order to create this or generate this perfect system of control. But Heidegger says something else about Raum, in German about space, which is that what comes before abstract space, abstract absolute space, of which there are then relative spaces, what comes before is place, Ort in German. So that means that for us as mortals, because you've mentioned, right, when I say Earth, probably most of us will have an immediate image of the mind, depending on how your mind works, but you might think of the planet. And we go to, one of the things that maybe is a takeaway, speaking of learning outcomes, which there shouldn't be because it should be very open, but maybe one of the things you can learn here or should learn is to spot all these abstractions that we usually live in, right? So we think of saving the planet. What I always like to say is I'm so short-sighted, I can't even see the other side of the room without my glasses on, just as an example. So Earth is the immediate landscape where I am. I just started reading a book by an Irish author, published, I think, last year. It's called The Way Home. And he moves back to Ireland from London. And it's a beautiful book written on what it's like to live completely without technology in a cabin that he built himself. And one of the things he says in the introduction is, it's so difficult just to make sense of the place where you are immediately where you are, just of that landscape in which you are, just trying to find a home there. And that's, I think, what Heidegger is trying to get back to, is this sense of landscape and earth rather than a sheer abstraction. But dimension is also a nice word, just very briefly. So dimension usually for us, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, because I'm not very good with physics and mathematics, but dimension we like to think of also as an abstract entity or realm or so. For Heidegger, Heidegger actually uses the word dimension more and more in the 50s and 60s. And for Heidegger, dimension is a concrete realm that we're in. And that's also, so for example, so there is Gestell, right? There is enframing. There's this world of techniques, of machines, etc. But that's not the only dimension that there is. There's also the dimension where we're mortal, finite beings, where there is, as he says, there's still a song lingering above our heads. We can kind of still tap into that other dimension. So what Heidegger does, interestingly, maybe on some level, I'm just thinking of this now, is that he plays with these notions and takes them from physics, right? And says something like, you can think of dimensionals in a different way, which is we're in several dimensions all at the same time. And we're never just in one dimension. And on this, very importantly, because this has to do with what Nick said and what others have said on the internet, and the internet is sort of a surveillance system, because Nick mentioned it comes from the military industrial complex, right? But that's true. And yes, we're being watched, right? It's obvious. Everyone knows that. You've got an iPhone, probably everything's being recorded. So the all-seeing eye pretends to see everything. But then you can question, you can ask, does this all-seeing eye really see? Or what it sees or pretends to see and hear is just data, right? It's just certain buzzwords, and you're smiling, you're making a sad face. Or does it see you? Does it see the way you are and the relationships you have and the world that you're in? And I would say no, it can't. Like, this eye cannot see that. And so I'm because it has to do with it's in a different dimension from us, right? And
Johannes, can I tie on to that? Because it's very interesting what you say, because there's actually 2 points I would like to tie on. One of them is the all-seeing eye, does it see? Well, this might be a nice connection with Foucault through Deleuze, the panopticon. Because the panopticon, you have an all-seeing eye, but the eye, it really doesn't matter if it sees or not. What matters is that we act as if we are being watched all the time. So it's not about are they seeing us, but are we acting like we are being seen? And the other point is, you mentioned this author who goes into the forest, into a cabin outside of technology. But of course, the cabin is technology, and it reminds me of this movie about this guy who goes, into the movie Into the Wild, but he's using like nature as a resource for enjoyment or something like that. So my question with that is, actually, it could be answered from Heidegger, but also from Deleuze. Is there a possibility to be outside of technology, or is it rather something like that we have an expanded awareness in which technology also has a place? Because for me, what I notice, sometimes it's very subtle, but in most texts I read, there's this, like, we must go out of technology. But this escape and this outside, this is already built into it. So that's actually a two-part question. Is there an outside to technology? And if there is, do we need to go there, or can we just also stay here?
It's a great question. Would anyone like to take a stab at it?
I can try and take a stab at it. Yeah, that's a really good point, that like sort of drawing the line. I think that's something that distinguishes Heidegger from a lot of people. I think is that his opinion that technology is different from tools. So we might say like the cabin, Johannes, feel free to disagree, but like the cabin similar to like a windmill is not the same as like a dam or something like that. And so Heidegger does want to say there is a discontinuity in history between sort of everything up to the 19th century and afterwards. And a lot of people, I think, take issue with that. They say that no, like everything is just tools. And Heidegger addresses this in the essay Question Concerning Technology. So I think that's an objection that a lot of people want to make, and I'm always interested to hear about it because, for example, one of the earliest texts, to bring another thinker into it, who's relevant, who had some influence on Heidegger, is Spengler, Oswald Spengler. He wrote a book in 1932 called Man and Technics. It's one of like the first attempts at a philosophical treatment of technology. Very different from Heidegger's and like probably honestly not as successful, but it's still interesting. And there's an example of somebody who sees technology as totally continuous from the Egyptians, from prehistorical times, all the way up till now. It's just sort of an extension of man as a biological creature. And so that is an image, I think that's the more kind of popular image of what technology is. It's just like tools and it continuously gets better and better. And I think something that's interesting that we can question in Heidegger is it as discontinuous as he makes it? Is the windmill so different from the electrical dam? Anyway, that's well.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to add to that
Yeah.
or take another stab at it? Yeah.
Can I maybe echo some of that and take another stab at it?
Please.
I'm loving the translation of technics because it's helping me think more broadly about technology. And maybe just to bring this into the concrete, and hopefully we can transcend that. But from my experience working in drug and alcohol, the difficulty of getting outside of technics is someone comes and sees me, and this is, I think, the difficulty of it. There's being embedded within capitalism, there's an expectation that after 90 minutes, they're going to feel better. It's almost like the techniques of like something like CBT is a kind of technology to extract productivity from the mind. It's like, get me out of addiction so I can get something from the mind. And so that expectation that it makes a kind of a disclosure, like for someone to come into me, it makes something like a diagnosis, which I want to really rebel against, kind of be very phenomenological and say, okay, I don't know if you have depression because we're just meeting and I want to talk, I want to know you, I want to take a radical phenomenological stance, but I've got to say something at the end of 90 minutes that someone can go home with. So it's like, okay, if I just give them depression, I can then have this whole set of tools that I can offer them. So I think that's the difficulty of transcending it. And I can just say one way, like I try to do it, and this is maybe a little more Deleuzean. It's like, I'll charge people, I'll say, to see me, you have to give me a dream. Like, and so almost like shaking it's like, I'm not taking cash from you. And then it kind of opens up anew. And then I can use dreams in my research project and so that gives us the kind of, if we don't come up with anything for 3 weeks, it's a little safer, but you also have to eat. And I think that's the kind of, in my case, the difficulty of deterritorializing in mental health is, we're embedded in expectations that are like, that come before we ever meet. But I think there are opportunities to escape it. And also work within it as well.
Very good. Someone has crying children in the background, and I have nothing against crying children, just when you're not talking. Muting the mic would be excellent. Anyone else want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I would chime in. I would say in terms of a continuous tradition of thinking about technology, I've got Aristotle's Politics right here, and in Book 1, he talks about the nature of property and the nature of instruments. So this idea that what a technology is an instrument, and that human beings can be reduced to this level of instrumentality through slavery. Whereas I think, and I think that goes all the way through up until, I guess you could try and find an alternative view in the thinkers of the Industrial Revolution like Marx, but up to this kind of Heideggerian idea that technology is not turning human beings from what they are as human beings into instruments, but turning what it is to be human into something instrumental.
Okay. Anyone else? Mark, David B, other Brian, who else? Joshua, anything on this?
Could I pose a question to Johannes real quick about the essence of technology as in framing? I know that I don't think he likes that word, but as far as like challenging forth the idea of standing reserve or standing resource, something occurred to me when I was reading Foucault. So many thanks to Justin for getting me to read my own books. That's wonderful. And so this is in framing in terms of like the pillory. And so the idea here would be like putting nature in the dock. So in terms of a certain interrogation, basically trying to apply actionable intelligence from nature and then to exploit that intelligibility that we find there. And so when you pose the question why, since Heidegger is arriving, it appears to be at art at the end of it, would it be totally technically incorrect to say that this has to do with fulfilling the creative potentiality of the species? That's basically what I'm going with.
You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not sure I fully understand. So you're saying that there could be something in technology that would allow us to act out on our creative potential.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, well, a few things to try to synthesize what's being said, what was said before. Now, what Brian said on his work as a therapist, that's exactly, it's, you have to give me something I can work with. So I need to be depressed. I need to be this. That's this way of thinking in terms of everything as a standing reserve. So that's, it's already kind of, everything's formatted. There's nothing that can open up in and by itself. Comes back to the problem of the learning outcome, right? A philosophy seminar by its definition cannot have a learning outcome. That's impossible. I would at least think that it's very impossible, because there's always there's always something that happens in a conversation that you couldn't have planned for. And what the difference is, to come back to Lewis' point, between the windmill and the Hoover Dam, for example, is that the windmill only moves when the wind is blowing. And it needs something else so it needs the wind, it needs the seasons. The Hoover Dam, and even more so, the nuclear power plant, does not need any seasons. And we now don't need seasons ever, right? We can just grow cucumbers in styrofoam. You can eat cucumbers that have never seen Earth. And that's something. So my point is always, maybe that's not very philosophical or academic, but if you don't see the discontinuity between cucumbers being grown in styrofoam and everything else before then I don't think that you'll ever see what Heidegger is trying to get at, that there is this extreme shift away. But what he's from instrumental technology. So what happens in technics is that there is an explosion of power. And that's something that we're riding, right? To get to Justin's notion here. We're riding this wave of intense power. But while we're riding this wave, we're also, according to Heidegger, we're also functionaries of techniques, because we actually just execute demands that challenges us to turn everything into a standing reserve or resource, including us. So that actually destroys human creativity, freedom, self-motivation, we become, to speak in a metaphor, homo fabers. And what Heidegger does in the technology essay, as you mentioned, towards the end of it, he says that we should be mindful that techne does not just mean the challenging, does not just mean challenging production or forceful production, but can also mean creative or being artistic. And so there is something, it's almost like he's trying to remind us of dimensions or ways of being that we've forgotten, and that we forget because of this explosion of power that overpowers us. Very few people feel that they are actually liberated by it, which, because technology is liberating. I mean, obviously it is, right? It's so much of what we would have to do is automated. Even just something silly as a dishwasher which to us is so so innocuous at this point. It's just everywhere. We don't even think about it. So that's freeing a lot of, in theory, should free tremendous creative energies, but it very often doesn't. It actually, apparently, to speak in a completely non-Heideggerian way, what do? We consume content. We watch Netflix. We try to sort of ignore. Heidegger says something very, I think, important. He talks about boredom very early on, that we're extremely bored with life, even though there is this explosion of power happening. And what then we have to appreciate again is something very weird, I think, and that has to do again with death. By accepting a certain limitation, that, I think, frees those creative energies that we have and lets us focus in on something we really need to do, because everyone sort of has their, I think, would have a proper project or some way of self coming into one's own. But what we want, this is also Justin's project overall, I think, is to come into one's full way of being. That's one way you put it sometime last year, I think. And that's something that technology could afford us, but that we're not doing because we're functionaries of it. Well, Heidegger says in a text, which is in German, die Kehre, the turning, that we mustn't become the slaves of technology. We must actually we must become the masters of technology. And that has to do with accepting the limitations of technology, but also the acceptance that there are other dimensions that we're in at the same time, and not thinking or representing the world in terms of formats, as for example, then happens, as we can see in a concrete example that Brian gave, that we want to have the solution before anything even is allowed to happen. But that's also the way that techniques works, right? It turns everything into everything is a priori. It's not even allowed to occur. Heidegger is the philosopher of the Ereignis, of the event. That's his way of thinking. So phenomena need to be allowed to occur in and by themselves. And that has to do with what Justin mentioned before on instrumental rationality. The trouble with everything is, especially universities, is that it's all under the rule of instrumental rationality. Once you get rid of that, but let something occur in and of itself, and also yourself occur, that opens up this other way of being, and it becomes a playful interaction with technology that at the same time must be mindful of its destructive features as well. Because don't forget, Heidegger writes at a time about technology where people thought that this is it, we will have a perfect liberation by the end of the century. Everything will run on a cybernetic positive feedback without any mistakes ever occurring, no errors. We will use nuclear energy purely for peaceful means, etc. So this is what he's sort of writing, not against, but warning against, that there's always danger wherever there is also saving grace, but so that you can't have one without the other.
That's great. That's great. So I'd really like to hear from Mark, from David B, and from the other Brian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I jump in on that? I think that this line of discussion is really fascinating. I think the way you phrase it as standing reserve in terms of positioning things or parameterizing things such that they're like ready at hand and exploitable is really interesting. I think that maps pretty cleanly into like the notion of like free energy from thermodynamics and from like models of like agency, like reinforcement learning and stuff like that, and artificial intelligence, where we frame or like conceptualize an agent as something that like a an engine or a machine, a cybernetic circuit that reaches out into its environment, consumes free energy or the standing reserve, and uses that to invest in its future capacity to consume free energy. And I think that's the will to will, Johannes, that you were talking about as such a essential idea of Heidegger, which is really interesting. And I think that ties into what we're talking about in terms of instrumental rationality and the way in which we need to like master technology, like in order to conduct this flow of energy to become the circuit. You have to sort of, it narrows the different future paths that are open to you. It's like if you're like balancing on like a balance beam, if you sway too far to the side, you're going to fall off. If you sway too far to the side in terms of, running a business or whatever it is, building your computer, then the whole thing falls apart and it fails to constitute a circuit. So I think from this sense, like that's why technology is so, it's like liberating in the sense that it like empowers us and like lets us do and accomplish all these different things that we couldn't do previously. And that's why it's so exciting. And there's always this like gradient in order to, make us buy more into technology. But at the same time, it really constrains the ways in which we're interested in operating or able to operate. Because otherwise, we're faced with the choice of more technology versus losing the ability to constitute technology. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, very briefly, very good. So, because what you say is that on the one hand, these cybernetic, these positive feedback loops, that's the explosion of power, right? That's where the power comes from. But at the same time, so we have to be able to not just write these waves, but also kind of to control them somehow, without them being in control of us all the time. But while we try to do that, we forget everything else. Right, and this comes back to Giovanni's point on concealment, etc. We need this weird point. We need concealment. We need withdrawal. We need something that denies itself and avoids full presence, because that's where eros is, right? That's where any kind of true eroticism takes place. That's where beauty emerges too. Something that's fully present in front of you the entire time. You don't even see it anymore. Just stand in front of a Turner painting. You go too closely towards it, you don't see the painting. You need to be very far away from it, this master of shadow and light, right? To begin to see its movement. The same is true for Van Gogh. There's nothing you see when you're too closely, because we could use these wonderful machines that we have to get very closely to the structure of the painting and look at how he's. We will never see the magic of the painting if we only look at sort of the combination of the colors and explain how they interact. No, there's something that you only see when you truly, again, see it. So the all-seeing eye could not see, I would say, the truth, as Heidegger would put it, of that painting. And I think the art, to bring this back to Joshua's point, right? How can we be creative still? Is exactly in realizing that we are in these loops. We're writing them and they're writing us, and sometimes we take control and very often they take control and whatever they are. But more often than not, there's also something else outside of them that they cannot fully recognize or don't even want to know that it's there. And that's where, from that perspective, you can then see the rules of the game, if you like, and play with them. And that's where your own creativity comes in. And this is also something I think that Justin has done, right? Sorry for speaking, instinctively or knowingly also, from reading Deleuze and Heidegger and all the others, and then says, oh, I'm not playing this game anymore of academia. I'm leaping out of it. And that's what I've seen, amongst others, thanks to Justin, is that it's possible to not follow this path of I need to do this, and then I get this job, and then I can publish. Maybe in 20 years I can do this. Because you being then something else, and that's the weird thing. Like we nowhere you go, any corporation or any academic institution, probably almost no one wants to do what they're doing. It's like, oh, it's so weird. All this admin work is getting more. Like, why is that? Well, if you're a weird Heideggerian, then it's because Techne is at work. It's not any one of us. It's something being done to us. We're suffering through it, and we're responding to it by sheer passivity, because we're all playing the game. But still, you can take the step back or outside, and then all of a sudden something else lights up. But as we know, the philosopher who leaves the cave in Plato has to come back down. So you can never fully leave. So that comes back to your point, Brian, is that, these circuits are there. Sometimes they will rule you, but other times you can ride with them and actually enforce something that's creatively important.
That's great. Thanks so much, Johannes. I'd really love to. Yeah, go ahead, David B, please.
And riff off that a little bit. The idea that we're completely free right now in today's society, and there's this sort of paradox that even though we can express everything we want, we actually can't, because there's these in social media and such, there's these like analogies or abstractions that we have that sort of fall into that people perceive, and then and that kind of suppresses creativity. So just going back to the idea of discipline and control, and this notion that we used to have this format of discipline, which was this structure at the top, which was controlling everything. And now if we just say we're completely free, like we actually we're frightened to death of being free as humans collectively, as a society. And so I wonder if we sort of invented these ways to try to control us through these abstractions, which are these labels that we give each other on social media and things like that.
Anyone else want to take that up, respond to that, question that?
I wouldn't mind talking about this. I think this issue of creativity and freedom is really important because it's what, for a lot of us questioning concerning technology, I think it's what psychoanalysts would call a symptom. It's the reason we've realized there's something wrong and there's something we want to change about this. It makes me go into a passage in the Bremen lectures I think was cut out of the question concerning technology. But Heidegger talks about the hypothetical of a government advisory council if it were to recommend the abolition of the radio and it says the council will be dismissed overnight, and indeed, because it only is what it is something positioned of a standing reserve in the positionality of the ordering of the public sphere. We are, in many ways, we are politically restrained or hemmed in by the role of politics as positioning the public sphere. And I think the same is true for creativity and for art. Our traditional modes are social structures of interaction around our own creative forces, around the possibility of creation, ends up as a sort being just another part of the positioning of the public sphere. And I think that's why Heidegger likes to talk about overcoming or finding some indirect approach, as opposed to simply, for instance, making anti-technology art or anti-technology experiences.
Yeah. Very good. Well put.
And if I could just kind of piggyback on that to kind of pose a question to you, Justin. To what degree do you see like the kind of routes of escape just mentioned in the postscript of jamming, viruses, and piracy? To what degree do you see that as kind of like I would want to think Deleuze is more sophisticated than just like technology or cybernetics, resist it, but jamming kind of sounds like that, like, oh, just jam the signal to kind of shut these positive feedback loops down. So I was trying to have an interpretation that is more kind of robust than that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they're just a few words that give us just the barest glimpse of what he might possibly mean. And unfortunately, he doesn't go into too much detail on it. But yeah, as I'm sure you know, I do have something of a fairly developed reading of this proposition. So I'm happy to expound it a little bit, but specifically in connection to the questions that have been raised. I mean, two of the big questions that have been raised so far are essentially very similar in their structure. I mean, Nick started the conversation off by asking, essentially the way I understood the upshot of Nick's question was, here we are talking about the idea of technological enslavement, and we're developing a kind of critique of how technology enslaves us. And yet here we are in this hyper-mediated, hyper-technological system here that we've used to construct this course and now follow through on this seminar. So is there not a contradiction there? Are we not, by having this course in this hyper-technological context, are we not just feeding into the machine, as it were? I took that to be kind of the possible kind of critical edge of Nick's initial question. And it also came up later in the question that I believe it was Mario asked. Forgive me if it was someone else, but the question of, can we ever fully exit technology? Is it enough to, can we go into the woods and free ourselves from technological enslavement that way? In other words, is it possible to access a kind of true outside? These are essentially two very similar questions that are structurally kind of poking the same difficulty or tension, which is this question of escape or exit, and is it really possible? Can it ever really be possible? And I do think that Deleuze here really does offer us rather extraordinary guidelines. And I mean, it's such a shame that he's so difficult to read for many people, because I really do think that if you actually do sit through all of those texts and really try to get to the bottom of it, you really can boil it down to fairly specific and meaningful guidelines that aren't trite, but they're not overly difficult either. And this is my interpretation of what he suggests in the postscript about piracy, jamming, and viruses. So I'll give it to you briefly, but one thing I want to say in advance to make this even more connected to everything that everyone's talking about so far is that, first of all, if it's not obvious for people, I want to flag that I believe there's a very strong consistency or relationship between what Heidegger calls this problem of human beings becoming a kind of standing reserve and what Deleuze and Guattari refer to as capture. I think that these are very, very similar. I wouldn't say exactly the same thing. I wouldn't say they're synonymous, but these two philosophical worldviews are, I think, describing very, very similar processes and problems with this idea of humans becoming standing reserve and then this problem of humans becoming captured by apparatuses. Okay, so I just want to flag that if it's not obvious. And, I think Deleuze has a very clear answer to this larger question that was posed once or twice about, is there really an outside? Can we really escape truly? And this was also going to essentially answer your question too, Lou, about what exactly does he mean by jamming, piracy, and viruses? The answer to these questions, I think, is that first of all, if you are thinking that there is some sort of outside to technology and how can I find that outside to technology, you've already missed the boat. You're already in a kind of instrumental rationality, because as I've argued in Britain before, the real thing that gets its hooks in us, that captures us or makes us standing reserve is, in my view, and in my reading anyway, is instrumental rationality. I think it's just the easiest way to summarize what's really at work there. And for those of you who don't know what that means, I'll just kind of briefly explain it in layman's terms. It's basically whenever you're doing something to optimize for some sort of outcome or value, you're thinking like a calculator, right? You're trying to think, how can I maximize my returns for the most efficient selection of means. And this is very much today in our day and age. This is the way we think. This is thinking itself for most people. To think intelligently about how to do something, it's sort of implicitly in today's kind of capitalist digital age. It's always intrinsically a kind of instrumental rationality. But I think Deleuze and to some degree Heidegger are essentially warning us that this is precisely how the technological machines get it. This is where they get their tenterhooks in us. And so if you notice the question, like, can we fully escape from technology? Can we really access an outside? Is it reasonable for us to be using the internet today? All of these questions are already kind of implying, they're already presupposing a kind of instrumental rationality. And that's why whenever your mode of questioning or your mode of philosophizing or your mode of creativity, whenever it's already presupposing a kind of instrumental rationality, you're screwed. I really do think it's that simple. You're always going to be essentially recapitulating status quo circuits. You're always going to be traveling down the circular train tracks of the technological apparatus. You're always going to remain captured. It's only when you can truly find that line of flight, what Deleuze calls the line of flight, which is essentially the line of flight out of instrumental rationality. And one word that has come up in this conversation so far that is a very important word for, thinking, for kind of summarizing what is the non-instrumental or anti-instrumental rationality of Vista is the word play. It came up a couple times. I think Johannes mentioned it. Play, true play. When you're truly playing, you're about as far outside of instrumental rationality as you can be. Another kind of key signpost here is the word immanence. So this is huge in Deleuze. And in fact, I called up just a minute ago. I called up in my recent book, Based Deleuze. I talk about this concept, and there's this particular phrase that or few lines that Deleuze and Guattari write, where they say the outside is, and I quote, more distant than any external world because it is an inside deeper than any internal world. It is immanence. So the radical outside is immanence. They say this very clearly. And so this is what I think jamming, piracy, viruses in a kind of actual concrete way at the human level, in a way that we can actually process as agents. If you want to escape the technological machine, if you want to exit technological enslavement, if you want to find true creativity that is not being captured by these circuits of control, you have to go through the inside, in other words. And this is essentially the accelerationist answer also. There's no kind of escaping capitalism or resisting capitalism. You have to essentially go through it all the more intensely, but with a greater sophistication, with a greater honesty, with a greater kind of attention to what's really happening. And if you are able to, and that's immanence. Okay, so that's essentially immanence. So in other words, to just kind of close this and try to make this little bit of a short lecture coherent, jamming, piracy, and viruses are kind of computer science type of terms that I think he uses somewhat stylistically because it's essentially an article about digital society and technology, contemporary digital technology. Jamming, piracy, and viruses, those have very kind of techie digital connotations. I think that's just a kind of stylistic accident because of the type of essay that he's writing, and probably also because of translation matters. But I would think of those as kind of the software equivalents of this much more essential process or factor of immanence, and doing things that are immanent. Immanence and play on one side, okay, and instrumental rationality and capture on the other side. And so long as you are acting immanently, which means being moved by your authentic, honest affect, right? So to give you an example, for instance, like jamming or piracy or viruses as a way to kind of escape the technological machine. It's not like, oh, write some cool computer code and then like it'll totally break down the internet and everyone will be free. It's more like tiny microscopic operations that we're able to perform on ourselves and on each other that are almost imperceptible. So just to give you an example, for instance, like I'm looking into a video camera right now. It's connected to the internet. I could, be linking this up to Facebook, trying to impress my friends. I could be doing any number of very normal things, right, that everyone does, right? But what led me down the track of doing, let's say this, like trying to have a genuine, novel, creative, kind of open, free thinking, philosophical moment that we're trying to produce here, for instance. I only ever was able to produce this by going down at some point years ago, down a very microscopic kind of opening, a line of flight, where I was just playing with my camera, right? I was just like, oh, the internet, this is like YouTube live streams. This is weird. You tell me I can just turn on my camera and talk into it and anyone can go on YouTube and see it? Like, that sounds weird. That sounds fun. Let me play with it. I was genuinely, imminently motivated to play around with it because it's just intrinsically, I saw space for possibility. I saw a line of flight, in other words. And so that kind of microscopic, radically honest and disconnected from instrumental rationality, that process of just playing with what is in front of you and pursuing one microstep by microstep what you're affectively, honestly looking for, that honest search, that honest pursuit imminently breaks you out of the grid of instrumental rationality. And that is how you get to the outside. It's through immanence. It's through the inside, in other words. So end of my answer there. I know that was a bit long, but I haven't talked much. So I kind of packed everything I wanted to say into that one talk. Thank you.
Can I try to make a connection between Deleuze and Heidegger?
Please.
I've been thinking about this and I couldn't get it, and I feel like some puzzle pieces came together because of what you just said. So I can make this connection in two ways. One way is, of course, to look at Deleuze and Heidegger as people who read other people. And then for me, the most obvious connection would be Foucault. I see Foucault as 90% Heidegger. And Foucault, towards the end of his life, when he didn't have anything to lose, he said that Nietzsche and Heidegger were the most important influences for him. And the other one is Nietzsche, of course. So that would be one way. And there are other works. I will post one link to a book called Perform or Else by John Mackenzie. And he writes about Heidegger and Deleuze explicitly. And the other one is if they're both addressing technology, and that made me. But I think there's actually two ways. I think they, because what you just said, Justin, was that kind of your way is going through it. And it reminded me of a story about Ganesh, the Hindu god. And someone told me there's a difference with the statue if the trunk is to the left or if the trunk is to the right. And I don't remember which is which. But one is the path of the kind of going into the Himalayas, going into a cave and meditating. That's what I maybe would call the Heidegger way, the Gelassenheit, the letting be, kind of not trying to escape it, but being in it and accepting everything and not engaging with it too much, maybe. And the Deleuze way might be going into it and jamming with it, and that's what they call the householder's way. So what they say is, yeah, you can be enlightened. Either you go into a cave in the Himalayas, or you have a family and you're like a good person and you're doing it that way. So that's my kind of way now of connecting the two texts, but I'm very curious about how everyone else sees that.
That's really cool. I like that. Thank you. Anyone else want to riff on that or related themes or a new one? We don't have too much time. We're coming up. We have 20 minutes, which is still plenty of time. So in particular, if anyone wants to riff on that, please do. But especially if you haven't talked much yet and you have some really interesting idea or some burning question, now would be a good time to go ahead and throw that on the agenda.
I think if I could, another thing from Heidegger that seems to resonate with the accelerationist spirit of Deleuze is this word verwinden, which Johannes was trying to explain, and it has this coordinating term überwinden, which is to overcome, and it sort of has this connotation of mastery. But verwinden is different, and it almost has this kind of these similar connotations that Deleuze's jamming and piracy have, where you're sort of from within, like the outside is within, this sort of thing. I mean, I feel like verwinden is expressing something similar, but at the same time, I would agree with Mario that there's definitely two different temperaments, between Deleuze and Heidegger. They're two very different, almost at a temperamental level, different responses to the problem here. And Deleuze, I would say, is more of a Nietzschean response, like the Übermensch, and Heidegger is something else. So I would throw that to Johannes and see if you would riff on.
Yeah, so verwinden, very good you bring this up. So I made the hand move, right? Overcome is this. In continental philosophy, you just look at the hands and that's where it is. So verwinden is this. Right? You go in and then you turn it around from within itself. There is in that sense no outside. So that's quite good to point this out. And yes, there is a temperamental difference. I would agree with you, Nick, and with you, Mario, on this very much. is that then Heidegger, he's the gelassene man. By the way, he didn't really live in a hut, right? He sometimes spent time there. But there is something, but Nietzsche, by the way, too, Nietzsche speaks of the Halcyon, the halcyon bird, and the halcyon tone in Twilight of the Idols, das Halcyonische. And the halcyon bird is the bird which breeds in a period of a couple of weeks in winter, I think in December, when the ocean is still, but it's already aware of the tragedy to come, which is the returning a tempest and bad weather that'll come around January and February. So I think the temperament is, to a certain degree, is quite different, because Deleuze is much more Nietzschean than Heidegger, much more someone of the will, whereas Heidegger is about letting go and letting be, as Mary also pointed out. But what they have in common, and this is what ultimately makes them philosophers, is a philosopher always looks for how to exit the cave. That's the question of every philosopher, is how do we get out of the cave? That's the question of Plato, right? So every kind of profound thinker will ask that question. And but what you see with Heidegger is when he goes, and this is in a text called Vom Wesen der Wahrheit, on the essence of truth. There's a short essay version of that in Pathmarks, and there's a very long version of it as a lecture course from 1930, which is on the essence of truth in Plato. And what he describes there is that the way, even just leaving the cave, and you read Plato, leaving the cave is painful. You step outside, you look at the sun, you don't immediately see the essence of everything and everything's blissful and wonderful. No, you have to wait. This is Plato. You have to wait for the night, and then your eyes get used to this new play of light and darkness. Then only then can you properly begin to see. But what happens in Plato is very important. Heidegger stresses this as well. Is you have to go back in. So this notion of immanence and play with, you have to go outside. Not really outside, but you're only free when you come back in and face what's down there, because only then do you see what's there for real. You can't stay outside. If you stayed outside, kept staring at the sun, you would go blind in a different way, right? You'd be blinded by the light of the sun. And this has to do, I think, also with, so very briefly, what David said, and also that dovetails with what Justin said, is David asked, are we scared of our freedom? And as a Nietzschean Deleuzian accelerationist, yes, we are. But we're not playing with the powers we're given, or also what Brian said, we're kind of being enslaved by them. But we can use them not by throwing everything away, but we can use these technologies and really just as tools for our enhancement, creatively, jamming with them, playing with them, because then we're free from instrumental rationality, etc. But it's not about leaving the cave behind once and for all. You always have to come back. Even Zarathustra comes back to the city, and there's a very wonderful chapter in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which in German I think is entitled "Vom Vorübergehen," so that would be on moving beyond, on moving over and above. And there, the ape of Zarathustra is outside the city wall, and it has become a cynic. So it has become cynical and hates on the people in the city. Oh, they're idiots, they're stupid. And Zarathustra says to him, look, if you cannot love the city anymore, you must move on, you must leave. But you cannot stay in this relationship where your entire identity is antithetical to the city, to the polis that you so despise, because actually you are just its dark shadow. So that's not the point. It's one, sometimes we might have to leave and go into the cave in the Himalaya, in the mountains somewhere perhaps, but it always, I think, even just for me, we have to come back down and play with it, and play with it in a way that we are aware of the forces that are at stake also. So
Well put. Thank you.
2 cents.
Who else? A few of you have been rather quiet. Don't be shy. Feel free to, speak up. Feel free to play. Take some wagers. Take some risks.
I want to play.
Please.
Okay. So I want to piggyback on what you were talking about in terms of the philosopher. Because what I'm thinking about is certain kind of population level trends that we're talking about, which is like, there seems to be this perennial thing in philosophy where it's like a small minority of people who are even concerned about examining the world in which other people and themselves are in. There's a experience of humanity and our inclination towards terraforming and building spaces that represent symbolic orders, living in them, and then never going to the outside, never leaving the city, right? Never engaging with the nature that we come from and forgetting, right? And I think the philosopher, or the one who wants to leave and go to the cave in the mountain, and I think that's a very important analogy because I have this image in my head of the mountain. If you think of yourself on top of it, there's this kind of, it's similar to the idea of the tower, where you're able to look above all of the things, like you're able to look into the city and see the motion and the movement. And I would say that a lot of what we have in our head now is this idea of the planet, right? Or looking at flows or systems, or even looking at a highway from a bird's eye view. Like we have that kind of in our head of how to make sense of our reality, and we see ourselves inside of these abstracted systems. But the cave is the inside of the mountain. The cave is going inside the mountain and understanding what is about being in the mountain from within, right? And so I think that that's a really amazing analogy for thinking about where we are now, because we are already up here. We are already looking from the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And so now it's the practice of, can you get inside of the mountain, and can you go from within to understand what this perspective of above is? And I think engaging in play and this immanence, right? And I mean, I think for me, Justin, like this has been why I've been so attracted to your project, is like, this is about play, right? And this is about having a little pocket where we can begin to think about what it means to be free in this context, and inviting other people into that. Because honestly, I think like this question keeps coming to me is like, have we ever been free as a species, right? It feels like freedom is a horizon. Freedom is this thing that we're always kind of pushing towards, and it seems like, you know, the Protestant Reformation, the kind of emancipation of zero, all of this is like, is breaking out of freedom, and freedom is idiosyncratic, right? Everyone has their own notion of freedom. And so like there's a kind of new horizon for freedom that technology, that technics, right, gives us. So I don't know, I'm just kind of riffing. If anyone wants to say anything about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, definitely. Who else wants to take that energy and do something?
Just super quick. This is, I actually prepared like a document. I won't show it now. Maybe I'll send it to the group or something. But about Heidegger, Nietzsche has this one line, I forget where he's like, Nietzsche's like, one time like a distant planet rolling out in the middle of blackness, like humans were suddenly born and they died and the universe collapsed and there was nothing left. And kind of like taking this zoomed out view. And I think it's in the Nietzsche lectures, Heidegger kind of quotes this almost kind of like, you know, obviously we can't take Nietzsche as not being ironic himself, but kind of like poking at this idea. And also in the Der Spiegel interview, Heidegger says, I have the quote here. He says to the interviewer, "I don't know if you were scared. I was certainly scared when I recently saw the photographs of the Earth taken from the moon. We don't need an atom bomb at all. The uprooting of human beings is already taking place." So, and there's a famous video by Carl Sagan called "The Pale Blue Dot" on YouTube. Probably people have seen, of like, we're just a pale blue dot in the middle of like nothingness, spinning out nowhere. So I think that that's a very popular view of like looking at our situation, and I really like connecting play to it, as Raven just did, of like play is the immanent, is looking from the inside and saying like we don't live from the perspective of 4,000 light years looking at our galaxy. We live from the perspective of an embodied person. So there's a really relevant video I'll post in the chat that just really connects with that point.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. And I've very briefly a nice little contrast for that. In Deleuze's joint work with Guattari, in the sections where they write about Genghis Khan and the Mongols in particular, they have a few lines where they highlight the kind of significance of the blue sky. And there's some really beautiful lines in there where they talk about the clear blue sky, and they're trying to basically say, this is a very cartoonish paraphrase, but they talk about how for the Mongols, it seems that the way that the Mongol war machine functioned, the clear blue sky was the ultimate horizon. And it was the only kind of authority. It was kind of it was the only thing they looked up to. It was the only thing they saw themselves as accountable to, this clear blue sky. And so it's at once a kind of awe and obedience, a kind of respectful awe to just the grandeur of what is above us, rather than looking down at the earth. It's sort of the opposite of what you just described. The small blue pea, and that kind of pathological perspective on human life and the earth is pretty much the opposite of what Deleuze and Guattari were celebrating in the Mongol relationship to the clear blue sky as the only kind of warrant, the only justification one needs, is how I interpret it. Because it's at once, the clear blue sky is at once this kind of inexplicable, vast, magnificent grandeur that we submit to and that we respect. But on the other hand, it's wide open, right? It's vast. It's so the experimental space is so large. The possibilities on the earth are so large, so that in a weird way, it's almost like if you submit to being grounded and you submit to being, well, if you don't mind me saying so, based, this kind of based attitude is actually the one that is paradoxically the most rich with possibilities. Whereas, if you think you're going to go into outer space and colonize Mars, you actually tend to see the world, you see the earth as this tiny little blue pea that's not even that interesting.
Can I just bring in with a tangent, but it's related.
Please.
Just on this idea of play and the kind of low stakes, high stakes kind of distinction. Go for the no stakes as a way to produce the kind of highest stakes. In this book, in The Last Temptation of Christ, there's this amazing passage. The story is during Jesus's life, and all this kind of back and forth of whether is he the Messiah or not. And there's this amazing passage where, kind of one of this learned, there's this reaction to this kind of learned pushback to Christ, where this guy is saying, why do you think, you say he's the Son of God, but really you also say he's the Son of Man. And why do you think that we've been having sex for so many years? What's the point of all these kisses and rubbing our bodies together? It's to produce the Messiah. We produced him through this thousands of years of having sex, of eros, and this, and the kind of just pointlessness of that all of a sudden has this huge point of this character emerges, right? This figure emerges. So it's this kind of, it's a tangent, right? But it's this kind of structurally kind of funny way of sort of saying a similar thing, of this sort of like, kind of eros free play, all of a sudden producing this, within the Christian mythos, this kind of like figure of liberation, that emerges out of it. That's all. Just thought of that.
Lovely.
About that, just briefly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so what that is making me think of is, so you're describing this process of like human reproduction, right, as having some sort of outcome, which kind of, to me, is a parallel to this idea of the end of history. And I would say that there's kind of similar architecture in terms of like Christianity and how it's created this kind of implicit sense of time and trajectory and progressive trajectory to the human species, right? I would say reproduction is not about some sort of end, right, where there's some sort of individual that has this emancipatory potential for humanity, but rather it's this continual process of bringing the humans and being on that horizon. I think the blue sky is a great example. The blue sky is the horizon of reproduction continuously. we are continuing to bring the species into play, right? I don't know if anybody's read Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse, but he talks about this idea of infinite play, much like an infinite game, where you're not playing for some sort of specific outcome, but rather just to keep in play, to continue to play. And so, I don't know, I think maybe switching from those ideas, like switching from the idea that there's a specific outcome to reproduction, which is like a kind of Christian mythopoetics, right? Back, or, you know, kind of pushing through to this idea that it's about this continuation. And it's about that horizon. It's about trajectory and like kind of always moving from a place where you're in.
I totally agree with you.
It's really nice. It's really nice. Anyone else? So I think we should try to make a habit of being very rigorous with time, because I don't want to keep anyone beyond the time that was scheduled. So that would mean we have only 3 minutes left. Part of me wants to say, does anyone have any last words? But then I fear that 3 minutes is probably not enough for last words. I think Raven's final comment about the clear blue sky as the horizon of human reproduction and the kind of non-instrumental justification for the continuation of life itself is about as beautiful and perfect a final word as I could have hoped for. So I think maybe my senses are telling me we'll let that be the final word. And we still have 2 more sessions, folks. So this is really just the beginning. We don't have to squeeze everything into this 2-hour session. We'll be meeting at least 2 more times. So Johannes, I don't know if you have any parting words. I would just like to say this was amazing. In my opinion, this is really fun and super interesting. I took a lot of pleasure listening to all of you. Really interesting stuff. And especially, I really appreciated how towards the end, I feel like the second half, we were all really kind of like making some interesting connections. It felt like things were kind of accelerating in a way that I could kind of feel intellectually. And I think that's what, you know, for any intellectual, that's what I kind of live for anyway. So thank you all. This was really awesome. And I look forward to seeing you in our second session. Johannes, do you have any parting words?
Same. So thanks all very much. It's been amazing. I also see people exchanging ideas there in the chat. We talked about putting on maybe a Discord server or something. So
yeah, we have one. I sent out a link. Everyone should everyone should have received an email with a link to my Discord server. There's a bunch of people in the Discord server, but I made a separate channel that's dedicated just for this. So yeah, if it turns out that it's not the best place for it, I could always set up some other more dedicated, focused place if we wanted to do that. I wasn't sure what to expect, so I figured I would just start by hosting the forum in something that I already have built up and that's already up and running. So please do, say hi in the forum and carry on the conversation, share links, whatever, between now and next session in the forum. If you didn't get that email or you need a link, just let me know.
Yeah, and just 2 more things. So I think either in the second lecture or in my third lecture, I will quote Heidegger, where he says, we can look at the tree and just see, you know, neurons shooting or electrons or quants or whatever particles we make up, or we could just leap down to the soil on which we stand and die, wenn wir uns nichts vormachen, if we don't kid ourselves, right? So he's pulling us, that's literally Heidegger's move, is pulling us back down from this planetary perspective just to this bare landscape right in front of you. And I have a lecture on 2001: A Space Odyssey, where I point out that when they show the trip to the moon base, one of the guys on the spaceship falls asleep. So this incredible travel to outer space is so extremely boring. It's so boring and dull that we fall asleep, right? So that's logos, rationality itself, because there's nothing hidden left, right? There's no secrecy, no mystery of existence. So I'll look forward to the next one, because that's where it gets really spooky, at least in my lectures, on the danger of language, etc. So we'll reconvene in 2 weeks, I think.
That's great. Can I just add 2 very quick things I want to throw on there? For those of you who were kind of more on the quiet side, that's 100% fine if that's just your style and you were kind of more interested to listen than to talk. Completely fine. No pressure whatsoever. But just in case, some of the people who maybe didn't talk as much, if that's not what you wanted, if you did want to talk more and really kind of share more ideas, I would just encourage you to next time maybe consider just jotting down your 1 or 2 big main ideas that you're most interested in. And then next time, don't be shy about really, saying what you think and pushing yourself onto the agenda. I'm hoping that the attention and the time was distributed as everyone wanted it to. But if you feel like in any way you didn't get the time or attention that you wanted, we can compensate for that next time. No problem at all. Just come prepared, and everyone should have plenty of time to talk. And the second thing I just want to say is, if any of you are making things or blogging or writing books or making videos or doing anything at all that's in any way related to this kind of stuff, Johannes and I would love to see it. So please do send us links and share it also. We'd love to share it also. So yeah, keep us posted on what you guys are doing, what you're thinking about, what you're working on, because we're genuinely interested. And I'm sure everyone else in the community is also. So, share it to the forum or send it to me by email or what have you. So thanks again, everyone. This was really awesome. Really great start to this seminar. And I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. Thanks, everyone.
Good, guys. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.